Good morning. What a delight, honor, and a privilege to be back here in Southern Chapel. I love your president. I said this all over the world. Dr. Albert Mohler is truly God's gift to the Christian church in the 21st century. Seldom have I seen or known anyone in whom God has placed so many gifts, so many talents, and yet all in humility. And so I'm honored that you invited me to come and speak. Again, I'm sorry we got snowed in Atlanta, and I tried every possible way to get out. In February, I couldn't, but God's timing is perfect. I'm glad to be here, and I salute the Jenkins family and their vision, especially in tying the center with a school that is renowned around the world for absolute orthodoxy and biblical fidelity. I couldn't think of a better place anywhere in the world for the center to be placed in order to safeguard the vision of reaching the Muslims for Jesus Christ. I have to make a confession to you as somebody who's been preaching for 27 years in one church. It's not very often do I go out and talk about the subject, and yet, really, it's a subject I spent a lot of years studying and experiencing. In 1982, when I was writing my dissertation at Emory University, I ended up going and spending time clandestinely with a group called Al-Qaeda. Back then it was called Jihad. And I had to do all kinds of maneuver to get to their mind and to understand. And the professors, the examining committee at Emory University, two Jewish men, who were wonderful men, and one of them remained a very dear friend, Dr. Stein, he said, why are you doing this? This is cutting edge stuff. Are you going to academia? I said, no, I have a better job. I'm preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. But anyway, we ended up, and the book was published literally before my dissertation was approved by E.J. Brill in Holland. It's called Revolt Against Modernity. And at the forum, I hope that I'll be able to say more about this and answer some of the questions that probably will not be covered. I wanted really to give you kind of a very broad, because I don't know, some of you probably have read stuff, some have not, and because not knowing this, I try to cover everything in a highlight form and hopefully get to the deeper issues at the lunchtime. Because there is no way you can truly comprehend Islam without understanding the history of Christian heresies. The two are tied together. And what an appropriate thing in this school that upholds the authority of the Word of God to understand the danger of heresies. Not just for what it does now, but what it does for the next generation. As many of you know who are studying church history, the first 500 years of Christianity, the church was plagued by a number of heresies. Many of those are being redressed in a nice clothes right now and sort of dusted off, and they're invading the church again. These heresies have mostly to do with the nature of the Trinity. More importantly, it has to do with the nature of Christ. And there were so many, but let me just give you three as a highlight. Arianism reached its zenith at 320. An Arian who was in Alexandria taught that Christ had two distinct natures, his humanity and his divinity, and he taught that only the Father is eternal, and therefore the Son could not possibly be infinite. Therefore, the Son was created. And that is why in 325, the Council of Nicaea met with all the leaders of the church, and particularly Bishop Athanasius, who fought Arian tooth and nail in the Church of Alexandria. They were there and formulated the Nicene Creed in response to that terrible heresy. Then there was Nestor, or Nestorus, as some pronounce it. He was the bishop of Constantinople between 428 and 431. Nestor insisted that the human Jesus was crucified, and therefore atonement is not divine. That the father-son relationship is only spiritual, but they did not share the same nature. Some form of Nestorianism, believe it or not, remain even to this day in some of the Assyrian Orthodox churches. The Council of Ephesus in 431 was condemned Nestor as a heretic, and many of these churches in Egypt and in Palestine and Syria and Lebanon pushed the Nestorians out of their territories, and believe it or not, most of them ended up in northern Arabia. I'm coming back to that. But perhaps one of the most significant heresies of the church that gave direct rise to Islam is what is known as Ebionites. Now, you would think that after Paul condemned the Judaizers in the epistle to the Galatians, that kind of teaching, which he called it anathema, or be accursed, and all of that would have disappeared. But indeed, it grew, and it grew further south, and it spread to largely some Jewish tribes who added Jesus to Judaism. And that mixture of corrupt Christianity and Judaism, but really more Judaism than Christian, is what influenced Muhammad, the founder of Islam, the most. As a young man, Muhammad himself heard the bishop of Najran named Qas preach Ebonite heresy, but he thought that was Christianity. But because of the limitation of time, there are a lot of books out and you can follow this. I want to really concentrate in this short period of time twofold. First, to let you know that what you believe is of uttermost importance. You say, Michael, well, you're preaching to the choir here. That's all right. Sometimes choir members go array, so I want you to remember what I'm saying. Why? Besides the obvious, is that modern-day heresies in the church, from heterodoxy to universalism to hypergrace to emergent church to the insider movement, and all of those heresies are not only dangerous in themselves, but what they will lead the next generation into that is probably even more dangerous. For it is a Christian heresy, this heresy of Ebionites, gave the rise to Islam. And the second thing I want to emphasize or highlight is that Islam today, particularly in the form of Islamists, is one of the two most dangerous threats to the Christian church. The second one is, of course, secular humanism. I wish I had many hours to get into this, but let me summarize fast. Muhammad was born in Arabia, 570 AD. His early life really was filled with tragedy. His father died at the age of 1. His mother died at the age of 6. He went to live with his grandfather, whom he loved. He doted over him. His grandfather died at the age of 8, when he was 8. Then he went to live with his uncle. And as a child, Muhammad suffered from epilepsy. But back then, they did not understand that it is a medical condition because of the fear of being associated with demon possession. In Mecca, Muhammad belonged to a large tribe, very powerful tribe, called the tribe of Quraysh. But this tribe really was made of two clans. There was one clan that is rich and powerful, and then another clan that was poor and weak. Muhammad belonged to the latter. The rich clan had the ownership of the running of the Kaaba. Kaaba is the worship center of the gods, of polytheism. They controlled the Kaaba, and therefore they controlled the fees that people pay to come to pay homage to these gods. And that richer clan oppressed the poorer one. Later on, Muhammad would concentrate his war against his rich cousins, against the other clan. But instead of it being a war between rich and poor, it ended up being a war between polytheism and monotheism. Many of the so-called Allah's revelations or orders to Muhammad about fighting and killing, which you see it and you hear it now. 30 years ago, I had to really go to a great length to explain this, but now it's in the news every day. But most of these surahs that supposedly came were fashioned around that time when he was fighting with his rich clan relatives. More importantly, as a young man, Muhammad lived with his uncle, and therefore he learned his trade. It's whoever you're living with, you learn that trade, and the trade was basically trading. They were taking spices and goods into Syria and Palestine and bringing stuff from there, and they were going back and forth, and he was trading, and he was very clever as a trader. His first boss was a woman who was 15 years his senior, whom he married. She was 40 while he was 25. And she was a business owner. She owned this trading company. And he ended up marrying her. But in his travels, all to Syria and to Palestine and what's the Nabatean kingdom, which is really in Jordan today. If you ever traveled to Petra or read about Petra, that is the focus and the center of the Nabatean kingdom. And it is my personal opinion, when Paul said, I went to Arabia, I think he went to the Nabatean kingdom. It was a very advanced city at that time and spent time there. But as he traveled to Syria and as he traveled to these so-called Christian lands, he saw the icons and he saw the bell ringing in churches and images, and he heard the Jewish shofar being blown. And later on, you see that in his confusion, about what form of Christianity, it came from what he watched Christians doing in these towns in Syria and Palestine, because he saw them there bowing to Mary, and then they were bowing to the Father, and they're bowing to the Son. And then he said, these Christians, they must believe the Trinity is the Father, Mother, and Son, which he vehemently refuted and defended the virgin birth. Back then, of course, they believed that the demons, whom they call gods, had intercourse with human women and produced children who referred to as the children of the gods. And he said, far be it from Allah to do that. And therefore, Mary must have been absolutely virgin. As I said, he defends the virgin birth. But Muhammad's life really can be summarized into 3 stages. The first stage, when he was being discipled by Waraka, who is Khadija's, that's his wife, the one I already mentioned, her cousin. He was a monk. He was an Ibnite monk. And he was discipling Muhammad to become a priest in that Ibnite Christian heresy church. And he taught him the Old and the New Testament, and he began to learn not in the Orthodox understanding of the Old and the New Testament, but in a distorted form. He taught him about monotheism. He taught him all these things, and he began to understand, and he began to see himself that all he wanted to do is basically try to help the Arabs to understand the God of Moses and the God of Jesus. But then came the second stage, in which this monk, Waraka, died, and he became so confused. He didn't know where to turn, where to go. The death of Waraka left Muhammad to be bereft, bewildered, and depressed. As a matter of fact, there was a documentary just a couple of weeks ago on a BBC documentary talking about that period of time. And it was an identity crisis, because a Muslim narrator, of course, putting his own spin on it. It wasn't an identity crisis, it was a confusion of where do I go from here? The man who's been discipling me is dead. And he did not know which way to turn, especially as the opposition to all his teaching about the one true God heated up on the part of his cousins on the tribe, the other clan. In his depression, he began to contemplate, who is he? What is he supposed to do? What is his mission? Is he really want to change Arabia and make them more like followers of the God of heaven, the God of Moses and Jesus? Into the second stage in his life. In the second stage, he began to see himself, probably I'm equal to Jesus and Moses. And in fact, he reasoned. Moses was a prophet to the Jews. Jesus was a Messiah of the Christians. Then I must be called to be a prophet to the Arabs. At that moment, he believed that he was preaching the same message as Moses and Jesus. And he called the tribe of Quraysh to turn to the one true God, Allah. Then comes the third stage in his life, when he had to flee Mecca to go to Medina, and there the third stage has begun. And this really is of uttermost important stage in Muhammad's life, because to this day, it's what influences what all you see on television, Islamists, extremists, fundamentalists, and I don't know what the word media come up with, but you know what I mean. And it began about 623 AD. After the initial acceptance of him by many of the Jewish tribes, the largest tribe and the strongest, after some thought, they realized they made a mistake, and they turned on him and rejected him. And so when this is really truly the beginning of trouble. And so what he did, he killed all the men of that tribe, sometimes referred to as the tribe of Karaja, other times it's pronounced Karisa. He killed all the men, sold the women and the children into slavery. Up until this point in the life of Muhammad, he followed the Jewish customs. They were praying 3 times a day. They were facing Jerusalem when they prayed. Saturday was a holy day, and obeying the feast of Ashara, which is in Leviticus 23:27, fasted only for 10 days, and then using the Jewish shofar to call people to pray. Up to this point, when that Jewish tribe turned on him, everything's changed. He said, we're going to go one better. We're not going to only pray 3 times, we're going to pray 5 times a day. We're not going to face Jerusalem anymore, we're going to face Mecca. Saturday gave way to Friday as a holy day. Fasting changed from 10 days to the whole month of Ramadan, and then the shofar gave way to the izan, or the call to prayer. After Muhammad became successful in defeating his richer clan cousins, he victoriously declared himself no longer to be equal to Moses and Jesus, but he is superior to both of them. Any prophet who came before him, or any teaching that is contrary to what he taught, is to be superseded by what's in the Quran. And it's the best known secret. There were many Qurans. There were many Qurans, many papers everywhere, written on camel leather and all kinds, until the second caliphate, the second successor, burnt a whole bunch of them and kept just one. He said any book, namely the Old Testament and New Testament, which he commended for people to read, he said, but if there is a contradiction, then what he has to say must be accepted, for those words in the Old and New Testament must be falsified. Let me stop here just for a moment. Since all of the teaching regarding the killing of enemies supposedly came by a revelation from the Archangel Gabriel, and to establish monotheism in Arabia. Today, this very subject that you see in the news is creating a huge debate among Muslim scholars. Some of them have converted to Christianity. One former professor of Sharia at Azhar University just wrote a book. He's in hiding right now. And I don't know whether to thank him or not, but he dedicated it to me. When I was overseas in a Western country that shall remain nameless, and I was speaking to a large crowd, he was in the crowd, he came over and he said, "You impacted my life. I watch you every day on television. I just want you to see." And I read this in Arabic and I said, "Boy, where are my bodyguards?" But it's creating, this whole subject's creating a huge debate right now. So many of the moderate, you hear them as moderate, but they are modernist thinking within Islam, are saying that these killing of the infidels, these supposedly revelations that came, they were only revelations meant for Muhammad, and they're only meant until the establishment of the religion. But they're not bound on all Muslims all the time. The others who grab the headlines in the media, the extremists, Islamists, fundamentalists, and all those names, they say, no, 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 no. These orders to kill infidels and be rewarded for it or subjugate them, it's for all time in all places until Islam becomes dominant globally. Now, this is something new for me, so I want to share it with you. What happened in Egypt 13 months ago was so unique in order to enforce this particular debate that I just mentioned. I, for one, must confess to you that for many, many years, I felt that these Islamists, the purists, the fundamentalists, the extremists, or whatever they may call them, they are the ones who have the upper hand because, for one thing, they're scaring everybody else. They're terrifying even those modernist Muslims, and they were in hiding, some of them. Not long ago, the retiring BBC head was interviewed, and they asked him the question, "Why are you so hard on Christians?" So BBC is, and yet you never say anything negative about Islam. He said, "Are you crazy? Christians have broad shoulders, they can take it. But if we say anything negative about Muslims, they will show up on Oxford Street and they will kill us all." I said, how truthful that is. Honest. But until recently, my thinking was that because of the violent nature of the Islamists and the advocacy of violence, not only in the Arab world, but for the rest of the world, that modernist Muslim thinkers will lose in the end. Until I saw June 30th, 2013, where 33 million Egyptians took to the streets in all of the major cities rejecting Islamist rule by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was only there for 12 months but brought the country economically to its knees. And that really brought out this modernist in force. What does that mean? Are we out of the woods yet? I don't think so. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden all these Islamists, they said, "Oh yeah, well, since this is now becoming more common thinking." In fact, that is forcing them to become more extremist and more violent. Again, at the forum, I'll be happy to share with you how these social movements, from the Wahhabis to the Muslim Brotherhood to the Takfir wal Hijra to Jihad to Al-Qaeda to ISIS, how these progressively become more and more violent in reaction. And so, not by any stretch of the imagination, we have turned the corner in terms of the violent part. This is a globally well-funded movement, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon unless God intervenes. In fact, now that they are being challenged by the secular government of Egypt, things become more dangerous. But let me give you some of the thinking of current Islamist thinking, where I, as I said, spent 2 weeks listening to them. And I remember one time in 1982, when they said to me, "Write this." They knew I was writing a dissertation. They said, "Write this." And they wanted me to write some things that absolutely contradictory of all of our Western secular mind thinking about Islam. And they said, we want you to write it because we know exactly where you live. I mean, I'm telling you, I did not sleep that night. But let me give you some of their thinking. In their mind, since Allah gave his final and last and best revelation to Muhammad, therefore the previous revelations must surrender to Islam. By the way, Islam has nothing to do, the root word has nothing to do with peace or salam. It is rooted in the word of submission or surrender. In the case of refusing to surrender on the part of the people of the book, Ahlul Kitab, or the Jews or the Christians, there is another option left, and that is they become dhimmis. Dhimmis meaning second-class citizen or protected citizen, as long as they pay a jizya, which the word does not mean taxes, it means punishment, it means penalty. And it could be up to 50% of one's income, in addition to the normal taxes. It's a form of humiliation of Jews and Christians, and clearly the implication is the superiority of Islam. Even to this day, if it's going to cost $1 million to build a mosque in Europe, but it's going to cost $2 million to buy a church that has been closed down, like many of them are in Europe, and turn it into a mosque and remove that cross and put the crescent, they would rather spend the $2 million because that is the highest form of superiority, expression of superiority. One of the Islamist satellite television stations, I saw that with my own eyes only 18 months ago when the Muslim Brotherhood were ruling Egypt. These Muslim scholars, the Islamist scholars, many of them in prison right now under the secular government, were having this discussion. And one of them said, this $2 billion that America pays Egypt, that's a jizya, that is a penalty. That is because America is an infidel country. And if they want to avoid the wrath of Islam, they better keep paying that jizya, that $2 billion. And believe it or not, during the Obama administration, during the time of the Muslim Brotherhood, they increased the amount of money that was given to Egypt and now suspended that there is a secular government in place. I will move on. Because that's probably was one of the most depressing things I've seen in the news. They said that is Americans' way of being punished for being an infidel country, giving us that money. The third jihad, and that's another important word that you must understand. What is the third jihad? Well, that means there was a first, second, and then this is a third. The first jihad was back in late 600s, early 700s, when the Muslims came out of Arabia under Caliphate Omar, the second successor of the Prophet, when he invaded traditionally Christian lands, and they did exactly what you are seeing on television today, that they're doing to Christians in Mosul. It's exactly, as I said, 30 years ago, I had to explain to people, I said, really? They gave them 3 options? Yeah, now I don't have to. You're seeing it with your own eyes. And they basically gave the Christians those 3 options. You convert, but because you're a Christian, then you can stay a Christian, but you have to pay this high form of penalty, or else you face a sword. That was the first jihad. Just as an aside, for you theological students, you must understand, here's another item in history to do with biblical orthodoxy. In the Church of North Africa, during that time, in the early 700s, there was a movement founded by a woman known as the Montanist movement. At the bottom line of the Montanist movement, without getting you all into the weeds, it says that the Bible is not a closed revelation, that God can still reveal himself in some other way or be just as authoritative as the Bible. The churches in Egypt refused. They said the Bible is a closed canon and we refuse to believe this. And they're rejecting Montanism and ended up in North Africa. Within 30 years of Islamic invasion, North African churches, in one stage there were 5,000 dioceses. That is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of churches and parishes. 5,000 dioceses in North Africa. That's the church of St. Augustine. Within 30 years they were wiped out. and it completely, because they said, must be a new revelation. The church in Egypt rejected it. Consequently, there are 10 million Christians in Egypt today survived because of the faithfulness of their ancestors. There they reached all the way to Spain, Syria, Lebanon, and they knocked on the door of France. During that time, they perfected this dhimmi concept, or this payment of the jizya, the second jihad, very quickly. And that is when the Turks overran Constantinople and they reached as far west as Austria. And the Ottoman Empire expanded to reach literally almost half of the world. And they began to have their own caliphate, successors. Today, in Islamist literature, if you read it, or you read their agenda for their big meetings, their conferences, they speak of third jihad. They said the first one reached as far as France and stopped. This one, second one, reached as far as Austria and then stopped. The third one does not have to have that much bloodshed in it. And the writers obviously did not check with ISIS when they said there's no bloodshed. Because they said the natural birth rate in Europe, in addition to the hundreds, in fact now is in the trillions of dollars invested by our petrodollar in Europe, will be enough, and they're optimistic way, they say, by 2025, many of the European countries will have Muslim rulers. Just an example that they give you, 5 million Muslims in France. On the average, 3.5 to 4 children to the Muslim families, while there's 1 or possibly negative for the French. So they say, you do the numbers. And so what is the Christian response? As we face this incredible threat. And it's a threat not because we know that the kingdom of God is here and yet to come. And therefore, we know where we're going. But I mean by a threat is a threat to very heart of mission. And so in my limited time, I need to leave you with not with a bleak picture, but with a positive picture. Not a positive that I'm going to manufacture it to make it positive, but it's true. Because I can tell you some of the things that God doing right now in the Muslim world is absolutely incredible. Joshua and I were watching this Yemeni thinker. He's considered to be one of the highest authority in Yemen. And he was sharing with us how he came to Christ. First was challenged by some of the radio broadcasts that I was putting on Transworld Radio. And then now he is in seminary studying in a seminary in the Middle East. So God is doing this in incredible ways, in ways that a few years ago would not have believed. As a personal testimony to the glory of God and my own condemnation, when I escaped from Egypt back in the 60s under the days of Nasser, and I left the country literally not knowing if I ever would be able to go back, I was so angry as a young man, I said, if I have nothing to do with that part of the world, I'll never be sorry. And I really burnt my Egyptian passport. But God had other ideas. Among many things that God is doing right now, and He's doing it with a lot of other people, is, which I try to help in my spare time. It's my labor of love. I'm strictly a volunteer with Leading the Way, is that in 2009 we launched a 24/7 satellite station that is dedicated only to apologetics, preaching of the gospel, equipping new believers, and presenting the gospel in a way that they can understand it. We started on one satellite, a European satellite. Then my son Joshua came to me and he said, Dad, we need to be on an Arab satellite. And the man of faith that I am, I said, they will never allow an evangelistic channel on an Arab satellite. Fast forward 6 months, Nilesat, owned by the Egyptians, called us. We watched your channel. We want you on our satellite. Another 12 months, Arabsat, owned by the Saudis. They said, we watched all the Christian channels. You're the only one we want on Arabsat. So here they are, we're next to Al Jazeera. And ended up with 160 million homes in the Middle East. And right now, there are hundreds of thousands of Muslims who are coming to Christ, albeit secretly, albeit behind the scene. But you know what the most disappointing part is? The Christian church. The Christian church is afraid to baptize them. They're still living in fear. And that's really the challenge. But there are exceptions with whom we work. In fact, just last March, we were in a Middle East country where Joshua baptized a young man who came to the Lord, watching me on television. And I didn't want to do it. I sat in the back because it would be too, we will draw attention. Incredible testimonies are coming on every single day. One very last important word. I hope I did not overstay my welcome. This is very important because there is such a fallacy in the evangelical Christian church now. The sweeping across, first in the main line, now it's among some of the evangelicals. And it goes something like this. If you speak the truth about Islamic ideology or the truth about the rise of Islam, it means that you are unloving toward Muslims. In fact, the term Islamophobia was invented by the Muslim Brotherhood apparatus in America in order to shame the West and the Christians particularly into accepting not just them, but the ideology. This deception from the pit of hell is rampant in America. While in reality, the more you understand the darkness of that ideology, the more we truly love the individual Muslims, the more true we are to the very gospel of Jesus Christ. When he said, I send you like sheep into wolves, Jesus did not say, oh, by the way, I'm going to knock their teeth out, or I'm going to defang these wolves. No. It takes more love to understand the nature of the wolf than when you try to Christianize them so that they become lovable. These deceptions, as I said, run the gamut from accepting Islam as truth equal to Christianity, as you see in what is known as the Insider Movement, to the liberation theology, where Reverend Jeremiah Wright, under whom our current president sat for 20 years, who at a press conference in Washington, D.C., referred to the passage when Jesus said, other sheep do I have, not in this fold, saying that Jesus was referring to Muslims and Islam. And it runs the gamut. To what has now become Chrislam. Chrislam was just proclaimed by a bishop of the Lutheran Church last week in Detroit at the conference or convention of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they say, just as you say Judeo-Christian, why can't you say Chrislam? The challenge for us, Bible-believing Orthodox Christians, is to be able to articulate the Christian faith lovingly, thoughtfully, most certainly truthfully, and fearlessly. Remember this, that whatever we do, we must never, ever compromise the fact that there is no name under heaven given to men by which they must be saved other than the name of Jesus. For one of the strategists of Islamists today, very similar to that of the homosexual lobby, they wanted to shame Christians into not just loving them, but loving their ideology. They said, if you claim to accept me, you must accept my belief. And if you don't, you're a bigot. It's a favorite word. We have nothing to be ashamed of when we say, I love you deeply, but not a false religious system. And that is why we are offering you the best we know to come to the only one who can truly, eternally save you. Now, contrary, the Insider movement today is a movement that has really impacted a lot of evangelical institutions, where they say, if it offends Muslims to refer to Jesus as the Son of God, let's just refer to him as Isa. But Isa is not the same as Jesus in the Bible. Isa in the Quran is that prophet that I already talked to you about. This began with well-intention. After Lausanne 74, Fuller, there was that contextualization movement, and there's Peace Child book was written, and everyone said, oh, that's how we're going to contextualize the gospel to Muslims, and just take whatever the Quran said about Jesus and say, that's the Jesus that we worship. And that is why the Insider movement is truly one of the most dangerous movements in the Christian community today. It's bought into by a lot of evangelical institutions that you would know, and we have respected through the years, because it is truly a heresy and not the truth. Let's always make the distinction between Jesus, the Son of God, God of very God, man of very man, and with the Isa of the Quran. And I pray to God that He will strengthen you to know not only what you believe, but what you teach is of uttermost importance. Father, I pray for everyone who's here today. I pray wherever they may be and whatever ministry you have given them, that you strengthen them, that even if they face trials in life, that you stand by them as you stood by Peter in prison and by Paul, and that you encourage them today. Because we know that one day we're going to face you. And the greatest reward that we will ever receive is, well done, good and faithful servant. In Jesus' name, amen.